Hello everyone, welcome back to Psychology 32, Lifespan Development. And in this chapter, or this slide deck I should say, I'm going to be talking about adulthood and late adulthood and some of the significant psychosocial things that happen in those age ranges. Okay? Alright, first, middle age. So talking about middle age, we're talking about anywhere in the late 30s to up to the mid to late 50s. Okay? And one of the big things that's important is something that we call the social clock. So the social clock is the timetable where we're supposed to reach social milestones. And again, I'm talking on a Western perspective here, but people say by the end of the 20s or early 30s, people should be married and possibly already having children. And that time is always, that social clock has changed throughout history, right? So it used to be that if you were a female and you weren't married by the early 20s, you were washed up. Females typically got married in late teens. Now it's not uncommon for females to get married in late 20s, early 30s, 40s, 50s, and beyond. But the social clock is that thing that typically sort of compels us to reach certain milestones as we age. Okay, certain things that affect our social clock is going to be culture. So if you look at it, I believe in some South Asian cultures, you never move out of the house. You never move out of your parents' house. You live there forever, and then your children live with you. In Western societies, by the mid to late 20s, you're supposed to be moving back. And now there's a big thing nowadays where individuals, students that have high student loan debt, end up having to move back home after graduate school, which years ago was something that was unheard of. So culture makes a big difference. Historical context. So that goes back to the student loan example that I just mentioned before, where, currently today, the amount of student loan debt that people take out is greater than ever in history. And it's really making it difficult for people to stay out of the house. And then socioeconomic status. Typically, the lower the SES, the faster people migrate through the social clock. Okay. Now, that whole idea of a midlife crisis, research has indicated that it's not actually true. It sort of relates to ERICKSON'S second to last stage, and we'll talk about that in a little bit. But the actual crisis that people go through is not necessarily true. However, that's not to say that things aren't changing. For adults, one big thing that's changing, especially in the United States, is their career paths. It used to be that you start a job in your early 20s, and that's the job that you have for life. You put in your 30, 35 years, you retire, you get your pension, etc. But nowadays, people have multiple careers. These jobs are not lifelong. You might stay at a job for 5 years and move, or 2 years and move. People don't stay at jobs for very long anymore. And so that's a big change when we talk about historical context of the social clock. Okay, now personality through adulthood. There are a number of things that go into our personality, partly genetic, partly parental influences, partly culture, and partly our experiences. Okay, all of these things tend to contribute to our personality. But research seems to indicate that our personalities develop very early on, and they tend to be very stable across time. If that's the case, then the two things that would be influencing personality the most are going to be early parenting practices and genes, and probably genes more than early parenting practices, just based on the research on personality. The big personality theory that we talk about is the Big Five, with the acronym OCEAN. So OCEAN, openness, conscientiousness, extroversion, agreeableness, and neuroticism. Openness is you're willing to try new things. Conscientiousness is your motivation to do well, how much you care about projects or tasks that you're involved in. Extroversion is how you outwardly display your emotions. And people who are extroverted tend to be very outgoing. Agreeableness is how well you get along with others. And neuroticism is your level of emotional instability. So neuroticism is always reverse scored. So on a scale of 1 to 10, the more neurotic you are, or the higher on the scale of neuroticism you're measuring, the more emotionally unstable you are. Okay? These things tend to be very stable, all of these traits. Even the emotional instability is stable as we age. And these are things that really aren't subject to change. The one thing that does seem to change as we get a little bit older is that our level of agreeableness tends to go up a little bit, but otherwise they tend to be pretty stable as we grow and as we age. And there's a lot of research on the big 5 personality traits in the field of IO psychology, industrial organizational psychology, and how this affects our functioning every day and how this affects our functioning in life. And in IO psychology, one of the big things is our level of conscientiousness and work success. And turns out that high levels of conscientiousness tend to be very, very correlated with our levels of work success and our levels of professional success in the future. Okay, so let's keep going. One big thing that's very important in adulthood is going to be intimacy or relationships. And when I say relationships, I really don't necessarily mean just sexual relationships. I'm talking about friendships, I'm talking about parental relationships, child relationships, as well as sexual relationships and coupling. Okay, everybody needs what we call a social convoy, barring the very rare exceptions to the rule of people who are very socially isolative. But a social convoy is going to be a group of people who tend to provide a layer of social relationships and a layer of protection. Okay, friends tend to be the most supportive members of the social convoy, most emotionally supportive, and overall our friendships tend to improve when we age. The older that we get, the more fickle we can be, the more choosy we can be with our friends and our friendships. We're going to take friends and take on friends that really support us, right? We've all heard of those toxic relationships, and as we get older, and our priorities change, and our families become more important, and there are a lot of things that we can look past or ignore. Ultimately, our friendships, the ones that we keep, tend to be friendships of people who tend to be more supportive of us, who tend to be more generous, who tend to be more giving, and who tend to have healthier relationships than others. One thing that is quite common is that married adults tend to have fewer friends than unmarried. Excuse the typo. But married adults tend to have fewer friends than unmarried adults do. And married adults with children tend to have fewer outside friends to a certain degree. And we're talking about close and intimate friends. And part of that is because you have a lot less time or energy to have those outside friends and those outside relationships. Okay? Now, about marriage in particular. Marriage is taking longer and longer to happen. Fewer than 3% of the population marries before 20, but by the age of about 45, 85% of people are married. And by the age of 65, 96% of people have been or are married. So, it is unlikely, statistically at least, in the United States, that you will not be married at some point, assuming that you make it to and beyond the age of 65. One thing that we do know is that early marriage tends to have worse outcomes than marriage that happens at certain points or later in life. So if you're marrying below your 20s, which is considered, at least according to the social clock, very early, you typically have worse outcomes. Okay, there's more instances of domestic abuse. There's typically less education there, and education is one of those things that's inversely correlated with both marriage and number of children. And it's difficult to say why, but one of the beliefs is that children tend to get in the way of education. So if you're going to concentrate on education, it's very hard to have children. And the research in particular says that it's not hard to, well, I shouldn't say it's not hard. It's not impossible to have a child and be in school. But typically once the individual has 2 children, school becomes very, very hard, especially if the second child comes along while you are in school. Completing school and moving further with this is very, very difficult, or can be very difficult. Okay, long-term marriage. Marriages do change and evolve as you age. Early relationships tend to have an impact on who you marry and some of the reasons for why you marry. Older couples tend to have fewer disagreements than younger couples. and that's for a number of different reasons. Number one is less financial stress. As you get older, there's going to be a curve where there's going to be more child care responsibilities in the beginning, but then later on there'll be fewer and fewer. So as childbearing stresses reduce themselves, so does the stress. So do some of the stresses on the marriage, and the whole empty nest syndrome, the empty nest idea. This is where the kids leave the house. Ultimately, when the kids are gone, the parents can sort of rediscover why they fell in love in the first place and what their relationship was about. Okay. Again, there are couples who do divorce late in life. They could have been married for 20 or 30 years and they get divorced later. It happens. But it tends to be unlikely. Okay. So why do marriages fail? Financial pressures. That's a very, very big one. Financial pressures invade every aspect of your life, and children tend to be very stressful. Children's different opinions of how to raise children is a big thing too. A lot of people go into marriages and go into relationships with a belief set and an expectation. And one of the biggest potential downfalls, I guess, or one of the biggest potential problems in a relationship is when you don't voice those expectations clearly. It's very common where people will have certain beliefs about how they're going to raise children. Let's say in particular with religion. You might have couples that are of two different religious backgrounds, and they might either not talk about their religious beliefs very much as it will impact their children, or be less honest about it than they like to be, where they say, well, it's not that big of a deal, and whatever religion it's going to be is going to be, but then all of a sudden they have a child, and it's not uncommon for you to want your child to have the same religion that you do. And there's not necessarily something wrong with that, but what happens is that if you have a couple that has different understandings or expectations of how that's going to be and how the child is going to be raised under those circumstances, this can cause fights. And it could be two couples of the same religion even, but they just have different beliefs on how it's practiced. That can happen too. So it is something to think about, and it's not just about religion. It could be about education. It could be about how you're going to raise a child with money. It could be about disciplining the child. What type of discipline do you believe in? Do you believe in discipline by force, or do you believe in discipline through behavior modification techniques that might be not forceful? Okay. Other reasons why marriages fail are if you marry for the wrong reasons. If you marry purely for sex, if you marry just because you're attracted to the person. Unfortunately, we all age, and unfortunately, we all don't look as good as we did in our 20s. Obviously, some people improve with age, but for the most part, things won't look the same, right? And if you're marrying only because you're physically attracted to the person, well, if and when that physical attraction is gone, what are you basing the marriage on? Now, an interesting thing is that arranged marriages tend to last longer than unarranged marriages. And this is a complicated statistic. It's a complicated statistic for a number of different reasons. But because people in arranged marriages, even if they're unhappy sometimes, and not to say that all arranged marriages are unhappy, but even if they are unhappy, sometimes they stay together because they feel like the pressure is too great. So if they weren't arranged, they might have divorced, where because they're arranged, they stay together. And it's not always the best choice to stay together. But that's sort of for another time and place that conversation. But arranged marriages sometimes last longer. And the thought is that part of the reason why arranged marriages can last longer is because with an arranged marriage, both couples are going into it with the intention of making this work. And when you go into a marriage with the intention of making it work, it can sometimes be better for the marriage. Again, not always, but it can sometimes be better for the marriage. Rather than going into the relationship hoping, I hope this person will change, or I hope that nothing ever changes this person, versus I'm going to join this person and we're going to develop a relationship and we're both going to put efforts in to make this relationship work, rather than I'm going to marry this person and make this person who I need them to be to support me. And I don't mean financially necessarily, although sometimes that's the case too. Okay, So the approach to it tends to make a big difference, or at least that's what we think when it comes to the research. Okay, one thing to know about same-sex partners and same-sex relationships. Same-sex relationships look pretty much exactly like opposite-sex relationships, right? The rates of divorce are the same. The rates of domestic violence are the same. Abuse, adultery, all the same. And the rates for successful marriages are the same. They don't look any different, because the reality is it's two people trying to figure out a way to negotiate the world and commit to each other and live together monogamously. And that's a hard thing to do. It's a hard thing to do no matter what background you come from, no matter what religion you come from, no matter what the sex or gender of the person that you're with is. You know, people are still people, and it's just a difficult thing across the board. Okay? So these numbers don't really seem to change for one group over another. Okay. Now, when we talk about divorce, who's affected? So the longer you're married, the more difficult the divorce is on the couple who is getting divorced. That's not to say that because you've been married for a long time, you should stay married. If there are things that are completely unresolvable and potentially damaging for each of the people in the relationship, if they were to stay in it, staying in it just for the sake of, not being embarrassed, or just for the sake of, not wanting to say that you got divorced, is not a healthy option. Okay? So, especially when it comes to children. I knew a couple who were in a very unhealthy marriage, in a very unhealthy relationship, and they were in it for a long time. And I was talking with both of them, and I wasn't pushing them one way or another. It wasn't my place. But seeing the two of them together, this was a toxic relationship, for the children to be around and to be in. And the parents would always say, well, it's better, who else is going to love them more than their mother, or who else is going to love them more than their father? And that's true. But at the same time, I guess it's relatively true, right? You can have adoptive parents that love them just as much, if not more, than their biological parents, right? But at the same time, having children stay in this very, very difficult and violent relationship, and not even physically violent, but emotionally violent relationship, and exposing them to this all the time, is not necessarily the healthiest thing in the world. And just because the two parents separate doesn't mean that either parent will love the children less. It just means that you're protecting them from whatever dysfunction is happening in the relationship. Okay? All right, about 50%, 1 out of 2 marriages end in divorce, but this statistic is a little bit confusing as well, and I'll talk about that in a second. Chronic financial pressure tends to increase the likelihood of divorce. We mentioned that before. Divorce is most likely within the first 5 years of marriage, and that's not to say that you made it through the home stretch if you made it to year 6, but it just happens that in the first 5 years, divorce tends to be much, much more likely, and second marriages end in divorce more than first marriages. And so this goes back to the 1 in 2 marriages ending in divorce. So it's not 50% of people who get married end up getting divorced. It's 1 in 2 marriages. And the reason why I make this distinction is that you're going to get these people who are what I like to call serial marriers, meaning that they might be married 4 or 5 times and get divorced 4 or 5 times. Well, if you have one person who has 5 divorces under their belt, that means you need 4 other couples or 8 other people to be married and stay married in order to offset this statistic of this one person who has 5 divorces, if that makes sense. So those people that have multiple divorces skew the average. So if you've had 1 divorce, you're much, much more likely to have a second divorce if you get married that second time. That is normal, or more common, I should say. Again, it's not guaranteed. Sometimes second marriages are much better than first marriages, and they last. Okay? So none of this stuff is guaranteed. So now we're in ERICKSON'S stage, generativity versus stagnation. So I'm talking about that midlife stage. And Erickson argued that what we should be doing at this stage in our lives is satisfying our needs through caregiving and employment, marriage, having children, etc. And again, this is a very Western belief set. Okay, and it's just based on Western norms. Okay, and if you feel like you're not doing these things, If your employment is not valuable to you emotionally, financially, in some way, or if you weren't able to marry or didn't have children, Erickson's going to argue that you might be facing stagnation. And this is when you'd probably try to make a change, and this is what the whole idea of the midlife crisis comes from. But again, we said before, research doesn't really support the idea of a midlife crisis, but it is sort of where it came from. Okay, now that we're talking about employment, which we did a little bit, employment is one of those things that's extremely important in adulthood. So we talked about school and social skills being very important in middle childhood, late childhood, adolescence, etc. In adulthood, employment tends to be the big thing, right? That actually ends up taking priority over your interpersonal relationships in a lot of ways. You spend most of your waking hours working, or at least thinking about working, especially nowadays, where as digital communications have become ubiquitous. The work / personal life boundary is being blurred. I mean, how many of us answer emails related to work or do work related things on the phone or when we're home, when we're out of the office? I'm not saying my behavior is normal, but I'll commonly wake up at 3 o'clock in the morning and respond to an email, and that's supposed to be my time. So it's just something to think about. But employment has a very strong influence on us. People identify with where they work, with their title, with their salary. It helps impact socioeconomic status, or people would argue even creates your socioeconomic status. Work hopefully offers both extrinsic and intrinsic rewards. Extrinsic meaning monetary of some kind or external. Intrinsic is going to be feelings of value and satisfaction, feelings of identity and autonomy. It improves self-esteem, improves self-worth, and increases socialization. A lot of our social world comes from work for a lot of the time. For some people, no, they keep their work life / personal life very separate from each other. But for a lot of people, their work life is their personal life, or at least a big part of it. And that's, again, if that's where you're getting your socialization from, you can imagine how big of an impact this has on your life. So employment tends to be very significant for middle-aged adults. Okay. All right. So we gave a very, very brief overview of some of the psychosocial factors in midlife. Let's talk a little bit, super briefly, about what's going on in older adults. Again, it's a lifespan course, so I do want to cover all aspects of the lifespan. So we're going to move on now to chapter 25. Okay, aging. All right, one of the most important things when it comes to aging, aside from the changes in our physical body, right? Things tend to hurt more, things tend to slow down, chronic injuries develop, certainly illnesses, things that we weren't susceptible to before, we now become susceptible to. There are a lot of physical changes that happen in adulthood, and it's not all bad, right? Don't think that it's all downhill, because certain things do improve, certain things don't get worse, but certain things do get worse. One of the biggest things that happens as we age is our memories tend to change. And I don't say get worse always. I say change, because some things in our memory sometimes improve. Some stay the same. Some do get worse. Okay? Some types of memory that improve is semantic memory. So the ability to recall concepts or ideas, general facts, that might not be related to specific experiences improves. Understanding vocabulary, and knowledge of language tend to improve as we age. These things get better over time. Okay. Now, there are certainly things that don't improve. Episodic memory, which is sort of the what, where, and when of our daily lives. Typically things that come from our short-term memory and transition to long-term memory get harder. It tends to be harder to learn new things. Especially new skill sets, it takes longer. And I even see this with myself. Having gone back to school, it's taken me much longer since I've gone back to school most recently than it did when I went to college the first time in my 20s. It just takes me longer. It takes me longer to study, it takes me longer to learn. It just takes a longer period of time. It just does. That's normal. Okay, there's nothing necessarily wrong with that. It doesn't mean I can learn less, and it doesn't mean I have less of an understanding of things. It just takes me a longer period of time. Okay, I mentioned this before, learning something new takes longer, and doing more than one task at a time is more difficult. Now, I'm not saying multitasking, because there's a lot of research on this that indicates that we can't actually multitask. What you can do is you can shift tasks quickly. And without going into too many details about this, but the thing to take home from this message is that your ability to shift tasks, or the speed at which you tend to shift tasks, tends to decrease. And that's something that's important when we talk about cognitive functioning or mental functioning. So you tend to switch tasks more slowly. And if that's the case, if you're in a situation where your job or whatever you're doing requires shifting tasks, it can be more difficult, right? So driving, where you have to shift tasks. There's a task difference between reading an exit sign and then turning off or onto that exit, okay? The reading part of the brain is different than the movement part of the brain. So typically older adults might drive more slowly because it takes longer for them to read it, process it, and then make the decision to turn off. If they drive just as fast as younger adults do, they might not be able to process the exit sign and then turn off at that correct exit on time. They might miss the exit, okay? Because shifting brain tasks takes longer, okay? Again, this is not all the reason why they drive more slowly. There's other stuff going on there, and not all older adults drive more slowly, okay? All right. Now, memory problems tend to be something that's very significant in adulthood, especially older adults. And typically when we see memory as an issue, we immediately go to Alzheimer's, right? That's the first thing that we think of, especially in older adults. But there are a lot of different things that can cause memory problems in older adults. And so I went through and I listed a few of these things here, things to pay attention to, because any one of these things or any of these things in combination could potentially cause problems in memory. And the truth is, and I hate to say it this way, but a lot of the times with our older adults, people just give up. And this includes healthcare professionals, this includes family members. People just give up and they say, well, you know what, you're old. How much time do you have left? I remember a terrible story with a neighbor of my grandmother's actually. She was getting much older, and she was having some tooth decay and some tooth issues, and the consensus was, well, why bother fixing them? You're so old anyway. What difference is it going to make? There was another issue with the same person, and it's really unfortunate. She ended up developing fluid on the brain, and this fluid caused her to really have her mental functioning impaired. Otherwise, she was healthy. And they basically said that they didn't want to drain the fluid from her brain, which probably would have brought her back to normal. But they didn't want to drain the fluid because she was so old. They didn't know if it was worth, taking the risk. But now without the surgery, she was wheelchair bound. She couldn't talk. She couldn't feed herself. She had 24-hour care. And if, this was a 25-year-old, even a 50, 60-year-old, they would have done the surgery, no question. This woman was in her 80s, and the thought process is, well, she might not live another day anyway, regardless of the condition, so why bother? And it's unfortunate. And I've seen it in nursing homes many, many times, where you'll have patients who their memory starts to go, and without really looking, very deeply into what's happening, the thought is, oh, well, they have Alzheimer's, just leave it alone. When the reality is, almost as often as not, if not more often than not, it's one of these things that's going on that can be causing the memory loss, especially if the memory tends to decline quickly. Okay? Anxiety. Anxiety is inversely correlated with memory. The higher your level of anxiety, the less that you can remember, and it's just a fact. And this is one of the reasons why studying for tests tends to allow you to do better on tests. It's not just learning the material, but when you study for a test, it tends to actually reduce your anxiety because you know that you know the information. So even if you did know it, if you were wildly anxious, you probably still would not do well on the test because your anxiety is going to make you forget the things that you used to know. Dehydration can cause delirium, can cause people to be delirious, but it can also affect memory. Depression and memory tend to be inversely correlated as well. As our depression goes up, our memory decreases. Infections, especially with females, urinary tract infections and bladder infections happen all the time, especially in nursing homes. And I cannot tell you how many times I have seen patients come into the psychiatric emergency room from a nursing home because they're acting out, because they're forgetting things, because they get paranoid. And once your memory starts to go, you start to get paranoid. That's not uncommon. And then we'll do a physical, and we'll say, hey, they have a urinary tract infection. Treat the urinary tract infection. Once that goes away, the memory will come back. And it usually does a lot of the time, especially if the urinary tract infection is what's causing it. And it's something that we miss. Medications. In this country, it is astounding at how much medication older adults take. It's not uncommon for older adults to be on 15 to 20 different medications, and these medications have side effects. And unfortunately, some of the side effects of the medications are going to be memory problems. And these medications also have interaction effects. And so, typically when we look for interaction effects, what we're really looking for is toxicity. We just want to make sure that taking the two medications together won't kill you. But what's typically much less researched is any other interaction effects between the medications. So if I'm giving you 7 or 8 medications, I'm looking to make sure that it's not going to become toxic. But a lot of the time, we're not looking to see, well, what other effects does it have? Is it causing you memory loss? Is it causing you confusion? Is it causing mood symptoms? This combination. And it's so hard because you're talking about not only multiple medications, but medications at different levels and people's body processing them differently. But anyway, I don't want to digress too much. Medications and their side effects can cause memory problems. It's not uncommon. Poor nutrition, psychosocial stress. Absolutely, right? And psychosocial stress gets into the whole anxiety component and depression component. So those can certainly contribute to memory loss. And these types of memory loss are temporary. That's one thing I didn't say before, but it's important to understand, okay? These types of memory loss are temporary. They alleviate when the cause goes away, when the anxiety goes away, dehydration, the infection, depression. When this goes away, the memory will come back. These aren't chronic memory issues. Substance abuse. Adults do use drugs and alcohol. Okay, just picturing that little old grandmother sitting on the front porch knitting. That stereotype, right? That mental image, that archetype, even, is not the reality. Older adults use drugs and alcohol. Okay, and the last common thing that causes memory problems is not the only thing. It's going to be a thyroid imbalance. So older adults that have thyroid issues might have memory issues. And again, this is stuff to look at. And one sort of warning, outside the scope of this course, but based on my professional experience, especially working in the psych ER, one thing to know is if you have, an older relative that's, under the care of somebody, if their memory goes bad, gets significantly impaired quickly, you're usually looking at something acute. You're usually looking at one of these things on the list here. Again, not always. There's so many different things. Or it could be a stroke, which is more permanent damage. But it could be something on the list here. And it is something that we have to advocate for. We have to advocate for doctors looking at this, running the test, doing the numbers. Because it's so easy to say, well, they're an old person. Of course, the memory's going. Well, no. If the memory gets bad quickly, these are certainly things that you should make the doctor aware of, or their caregiver aware of, because they might just be causing that. And the thing with this is that if these things get treated, the memory comes back. Okay. All right. So that's kind of it. That kind of brings us to the end of the material for the semester. One of my colleagues here, a gentleman named Oliver Clapper, he recently retired. He shared with me a comedy routine based on the late George Carlin. And George Carlin had this routine on aging, and he talked about aging. And so I certainly can't deliver it the way he did, but Professor Clapper would always go through this little comedy routine at the end of the semester. And I won't deliver it the way he did, and I certainly won't deliver it the way George Carlin did. But the little thing, it just sort of wraps up the course nicely, and it's kind of a cute little monologue that George Carlin gave. So I posted it in the PowerPoints. Okay, so his views on aging. All right. So do you realize that the only time in our lives when we like to get old is when we're kids? If you're less than 10 years old, you're so excited about aging that you think in fractions. How old are you? I'm 4.5. You're never 30. You're never 36.5. You're 4.5, going on 5. That's the key, right? You get into your teens, and now they can't hold you back. You jump to the next number, or even a few ahead. How old are you? I'm going to be 16. You could be 13, but hey, you're going to be 16. And the greatest day of your life, you become 21. Even the words sound like a ceremony. You become 21. Yes! But then, you turn 30. What happened there? It makes you sound like bad milk. He turned 30. We had to throw him out. There's no fun now. You're just a sour dumpling. What's wrong? What changed? You become 21, you turn 30, and then you're pushing 40. Put on the brakes. It's all slipping away before you know it. You reach 50, and your dreams are just gone. Okay, but wait. You make it to 60. You didn't think you would. So you become 21, turn 30, push 40, reach 50, and make it to 60. You've built up so much speed that you hit 70. After that, it's a day-to-day thing. You hit Wednesday. You get into your 80s, and every day is a complete cycle. You hit lunch, turn 4:30, reach bedtime, and it doesn't end there. Into the 90s, you actually start going backwards. I was just 92. Then a strange thing happens. If you make it to 100, you become a little kid again. I'm 100.5. May you all make it to a healthy 100.5. Okay? Again, this is George Carlin's views on how to stay young, not mine. Throw out non-essential numbers. This includes age, weight, and height. Let the doctors worry about them. That is why you pay them. Keep only cheerful friends. The grouches pull you down. Keep learning. Learn more about the computer, crafts, gardening, whatever, even ham radio. Never let the brain idle. An idle mind is the devil's workshop, and the devil's family name is Alzheimer's. And there actually is some research behind this, where if you don't do mental exercises, keep stimulating yourself, your brain will tend to decline as you age. Enjoy simple things. Laugh often, loud, and long. Laugh until you gasp for breath. The tears happen. Endure, grieve, and move on. The only person who is with us our entire life is ourselves. Be alive while you are alive. Surround yourself with what you love, whether it's family, pets, keepsakes, music, plants, hobbies, whatever. Your home is your refuge. Cherish your health. If it's good, preserve it. If it's unstable, improve it. If it's beyond what you can improve, get help. Don't take guilt trips. Take a trip to the mall, even to the next county, to a foreign country, but not to where the guilt is. Tell people that you love them at every opportunity. Sorry, that's cut off a little bit on the bottom for you guys. And always remember, life is not measured in the number of breaths we take, but by the moments that take our breath away. And if you don't send this to at least 8 people, who cares? But do share this with someone. We all need to live life to its fullest each day. Life is a journey. Life's journey is not to arrive at the grave safely in a well-preserved body, but rather to skid into it sideways, totally worn out, shouting, "Holy shoot, what a ride." George Carlin, May 12th, 1937 to June 22nd, 2008. Okay, well, that's the end of the material for the semester. Hopefully you've enjoyed the class. Hopefully you learned something. Hopefully you've gotten something from it. And I will post more information about anything else for the remainder of the semester and announcements on Blackboard if there is anything else to post. As always, email me if there are any questions, david.troy@kbcc.cuny.edu. I do hope that you enjoy the class, and I'm always open to feedback. Okay? Have a great next semester, and again, keep in touch.